I think the temptation is there in a society that has lost many of its foundational insights when it comes to respect for the moral law and the natural law. We've moved away from so many of them. We have a culture that widely supports and promotes the direct taking of life through abortion. We're moving towards seeing it in not only physician-assisted suicide, but euthanasia, and in other ways, some concerns around organ procurement that are occurring. So as the society veers in that direction, then the lawmakers become more and more tempted to try to impose their vision of, that's morally, has a moral deficit, really, at the core of it, onto the rest of society.
Welcome to the Napa Legal Podcast. I'm Frank DeVito, Senior Counsel and Director of Content at Napa Legal.
And I'm Joseph Clement, Content and Program Manager at Napa Legal.
So we have an exciting special episode this week where we're joined by our guest, Father Tad Pacholczyk, who's a priest of the Diocese of Fall River, Massachusetts, and the Senior Ethicist at the National Catholic Bioethics Center. Today, we're going to discuss a variety of topics and some updates surrounding medical conscience rights, including some current efforts to both attack and protect faith-based doctors and institutions. So, Father Tad, thank you so much for being here with us today.
Well, thank you, Frank and Joseph. Pleasure to be with you. I look forward to covering some interesting ground, I'm sure.
Yeah, absolutely. We're really excited to get to have you on and talk about medical conscience rights. So before we start diving into some of the content, Father Tad, could you tell us just a little bit more about yourself and your work at the National Catholic Bioethics Center?
Well, I'm a senior ethicist at the Bioethics Center, and I would say a lot of what I do deals with educational outreach. I do a fair amount of traveling and speaking around the country. Tomorrow, I'm going to be teaching in St. Louis. I teach every week for 8 weeks in a row to seminarians about bioethics. The next day, I go to Ohio. I'll be doing a white mass where I speak to medical professionals. The day after that, I'll be speaking on end-of-life decision-making, still in Ohio. And then a bit after that, St. Paul, Minnesota, to speak to clergy. One of their clergy conferences. So you can see I kind of do a lot of different things, but it's all connected to this effort to explain and help people to grasp the church's teachings when it comes to medical ethics, bioethics, some of the controversies that come up in the life sciences, and the need to support the dignity of the human person. We also, at the Bioethics Center in Philadelphia, where I work, we do put on, this is always of interest to people, a conference every 2 years for the Catholic bishops. And we invite all the bishops of the US, Canada, and Mexico, and sometimes from the Philippines as well. We do this together with the Knights of Columbus. And this is an opportunity to kind of provide an update and field, questions and controversies that might be in the minds of the bishops. And this is a 2-day event that we typically do. So it just gives you a sense of some of my work. I also write a monthly column on bioethics. It's carried by maybe 25 Catholic newspapers. And I do a fair amount of press and TV and radio work as well, interviews, that kind of thing.
Wow, it's quite a background, and it's so relevant to as we said before we started recording, you're obviously on the bioethical side, and we are focused on some of the legal issues, but surrounding a lot of the same hot topics. And this question of medical conscience rights applies to so many issues that we're regularly seeing in the news and in the courts, from abortion and contraceptives and IVF and end-of-life euthanasia questions. But before we get into some of the specifics, I'd like to just maybe ask a baseline question. What do we mean by medical conscience rights?
Yeah, so that term, I think, can cover a fair amount of ground, but generally one is referring to the notion that there are rights of conscience that individuals who are in the medical profession have and that need to be safeguarded. So this, I think, comes up just when, for example, maybe to jump right to a concrete example, if you have a pharmacist and somebody shows up at the pharmacy and they're holding a script, a prescription for, let's say, the abortion pill, and they want that to be filled, the conscience rights of the pharmacist there would include the right to decline to fill that prescription, recognizing that this is going to be used for a morally problematic purpose. Or another example would be if you were a pharmacist in Oregon, where physician-assisted suicide is legal, and again, you were asked to fill the prescription for the toxins that are going to be used for somebody to commit suicide. Conscience rights would allow you, and would in fact, necessitate that a person of conscience step away from the type of cooperation in evil that would be implied by filling that prescription. So conscience rights are very important for medical professionals. They're actually very important for all of us. I think there's sometimes a tendency when this matter comes up to say something like, well, look, you made the decision to become a pharmacist, or you made the decision to become a physician. So this obligates you to, pursue the standard of care or do whatever is included as part and parcel of the field that you're in. And I think that that's a very flawed understanding of what it means to be a healthcare professional. And I think one can just jump to a number of other examples and see why this is so fundamentally flawed. For example, just to pull one out of a hat here, if you were an Uber driver and you signed up with Uber or Lyft or one of these ride-sharing companies. So you signed the dotted line, you have some kind of a contractual arrangement with them, and you're picking up different people to go to different places. And actually, I recall hearing a specific story in this line about a guy who did this in Chicago, and he just loved doing the work, and he became really, really adept at knowing all of Chicago. He could drive anywhere, even without the aid of a GPS, after doing this for about 6 months. So one day he was picking up a young woman, and she had two children with her. They all got into the back of the car. She was on her cell phone at that point, and she was talking, and he started to drive to the destination that was indicated in the ride-sharing app. And as he went along, since he knew Chicago so well, his mind was ticking along. And all of a sudden, it hit him where she was asking to be brought to. And it was to the Planned Parenthood clinic. And he could see that she was pregnant. And so he kind of drove a little bit, one way, then another, kind of hoping she'd finish her phone conversation. And it turned out she just kept talking. So finally, he just actively pulled his vehicle over and stopped the car. And he said to her, look, I regret that I cannot take you to where it is that you want to go. I'm going to have to take you back to where I picked you up, and I will refund the fare for you, but I cannot, bring you to where you're seeking to go. And she was, a little bit surprised, but then she sort of understood, and he took her back and dropped her off. And, it was his conscience
Yeah.
that he understood he couldn't participate in this. And, people would say, oh, but, this is something he should have done. If you use a simpler example, maybe of what if you had the Uber driver who spoke Arabic, but the two guys who got in the back didn't know that, and they're speaking among themselves, and they're getting ready to, get on an airplane and do something like what happened in 9/11. Is there not a conscience obligation on the part of the Uber driver to not take them to their destination at the airport, etc.? So, conscience rights are a universal reality. What are they? They're an awareness of the natural moral law, and we're all bound by them. Now, that doesn't necessarily mean that everybody will choose to actively safeguard those rights or to act in a manner that's compatible with that. But this is something hugely important to our humanity. And, as a person of religion, I think it's important to emphasize that this indeed is one of the realities that one day we understand there will be a judgment. And in that judgment, there will be, a kind of threshing through of how our conscience, whether we were faithful to it or not, or whether we chose to transgress it. So this is something humanly very, very important for all of us.
Yeah, you made a great point that about especially the natural moral law being what's at play here, because you could see somebody twisting what you're saying about conscience rights and saying, well, I'm a doctor and my conscience compels me to euthanize patients who I see have less than a year to live, right? Because that's my conscience tells, but that's an ill-formed conscience. And it's eventually, I think, a challenge, especially in the legal and policy world, that we values neutral principles of freedom and so on will only take us so far before we actually have to make judgments about what is good and what is true. I would love to just go down that rabbit hole, but I think I'm going to pass it over to Joseph and let him maybe dig in on some of these conscience questions.
Yeah, and I mean, I would just quickly throw in that I don't think we can really understand freedom as something that's value free. At the end of the day, freedom is always constrained by some vision of the good. And so, it becomes, it's more complicated than people think. Just this notion of a radical freedom that's untethered from everything. That's a kind of illusion. That's not the kind of creatures we are. And that's not freedom. That's actually a type of slavery that's just masquerading as freedom.
Yeah, continuing on the freedom side of the conversation, a lot of times medical conscience rights, at least as I see it, are mostly depicted as freedom from something. In your example, the Uber driver should be free from driving a woman to an abortion center. Does it extend beyond that? Does this kind of become a freedom to do something? So let's say a patient says they're refusing food and water. If a doctor has a moral and religious conscience that says, I have a duty to this person to give them this basic need, does medical conscience rights extend into that as also a freedom to perform something that somebody feels duty bound to do?
Well, I would say that, I mean, it's a great question, Joseph. I think what you have going on in medical settings like that is the need for real dialogue and discussion to be occurring between the patient and the healthcare professional. And if that dialogue is not happening, and if, the healthcare professional has this notion that I'm sort of like a vending machine, and whatever the patient requests of me, I'm morally obligated to just fulfill the request, they have failed to understand the really the fullness and the beauty even of their own vocational calling to be a healthcare professional. The the doctor or the nurse who finds themselves in that situation, they bring a whole history and background and formation and resiliency and training that ends up being important to patients. And patients will be a lot of times asking opinions of their healthcare team. What do you think I should do in this particular situation with my cancer? And sometimes they'll even, maybe get a little bit personal. What would you do if it was your mom? And the doctor is put on the spot. And that kind of dialogue and back and forth will, I think, oftentimes work around some of the situations like you're describing where there's ambiguity. And so if you had somebody who's saying, I want to be, I feel like my time is up and I want to be basically dehydrated and starved to death by refusing any measures, the doctor, I think, can make headway many times by saying, well, why is it that you want to do that? And don't you understand that this intervention is not heroic? It's not something beyond the pale. It's not going to be unduly burdensome. Makes a lot of sense for your case. And, that back and forth will lead many times to a resolution that is good on both sides. So this is why I think it's important for physicians and healthcare professionals to also have some, interpersonal skills to be able to work with their patients in this one-on-one way so that then you can avoid these frictions, if you will, of conscience that appear to arise in certain desperate types of moments.
Yeah.
Go ahead,
Sorry,
Jesse.
go ahead, Frank, after you.
No, please continue.
Yeah, so just kind of continuing that sort of line, if that friction begins to persist and it kind of becomes clear that there's not going to be a resolution made, a lot of times the carve out that's made is, oh, well, the doctor then doesn't have to perform or refuse to perform what the patient wants. They can just refer it to somebody else. From kind of the philosophical and maybe complicitness of the doctor, where do referrals start to factor in? Do you think that that's kind of an adequate philosophical protection for a doctor where you can say you don't have to do it, you can just refer this patient to somebody else? Or do you think that is still kind of something that falls short of the protections that should be in place for doctors to bring their faith into their practice?
I would say it clearly falls short because the problem here, as we alluded to earlier, involves one of cooperation in evil. And the matter is that, for example, if your workplace requires that you make a referral for anything that you yourself would find morally unacceptable, the problem is that by making that very referral, by saying, like back to the pharmacist, they hand you the prescription and you say, well, I can't fill this myself, but here I'm going to walk over down to the other side of the counter and hand this to my coworker and he can fill it for you. You, as the pharmacist, remain in the causal chain that leads to the prescription of, say, the suicide pills, and you remain morally culpable, even though you yourself didn't fill it directly. So this is a problem that the referral cannot be something that you partake of. You need to, and in that case of the pharmacist, what you need to do is return the prescription to the person, the customer, and say, I'm not able to fill this. Now, you may be able to say something also to them, which is like general knowledge, like there may be somebody else here or in another pharmacy who can help you. That's not, you're not remaining in the causal chain. You're just giving general knowledge, which everybody knows. And then what happens? You have basically put it back onto the responsibility of the patient to now initiate a new series of causal decisions, a new chain with a bunch of links, but you're not in that causal chain. You have stepped out of it. And so, at a minimum, that's what our duty is. Now, there would also be a question of, is there a duty as a pharmacist on some level? Is there an opportunity? And often there is not, but to push back in some other way and say, I'm not sure this makes sense as an item to be prescribed from what I understand. There are risks that are associated with this particular, etc. So you step in and actively use your professional skills to help also dissuade from what would be a morally improper type of direction.
That's a really helpful, I think, segue from the general into maybe some of the specific issues that we face with medical conscience questions today. What I'm getting from what you've said is that the two main areas that would need to be protected in these various medical areas would be the rights of doctors or pharmacists or what have you from doing immoral acts that violate their conscience. So actually filling the prescription or doing the procedure, and also from being forced to be a part of that causal chain. So to be a referral source or something like that. Are there particular areas where you see, I know you're an ethicist and not a legal scholar, but particular areas of law or policy where you see conscience protections most in danger or most in need of strengthening in our society today?
Well, I think one of the things that I find sort of troublesome is when you'll have lawmakers step in and start mandating certain types of treatments that have to be provided. So there was a few years back a situation where I think it was in Massachusetts and maybe in a couple other states, they were looking at requiring that every woman who came to an emergency room and who had suffered from sexual assault would have to be given the morning after pill, as it was just sort of like by law, this is a requirement here. And it's like lawmakers shouldn't be prescribing meds. That's the bottom line here. What needs to happen in a situation of sexual assault in a hospital is going to be very highly dependent on the details of, for example, where the woman is in her cycle, whether it's appropriate to give an anovulant uh, pharmacological agent like the morning after pill, etc. And there's a lot that has to be done in terms of testing ahead of time because that drug also can have abortifacient effects, causing an abortion. And so you only want to use it in a situation of sexual assault when you know it will achieve its intended purpose, which is to prevent her from releasing one of her eggs to the attacker's sperm. That's an act of self-defense on her part. But you see, all these subtleties don't get worked into laws when you have lawmakers, who are often pushing pro-abortion agendas anyway, trying to mandate certain types of legal strictures onto the medical field. And I think, something similar has been happening when you have lawmakers passing legislation that says, look, if you talk to any gender dysphoric individuals, the only type of counseling, the only type of psychotherapy that will be legally permitted is affirmation therapy. You must tell the person who comes in who is gender confused that whatever gender they say they are, that's indeed what they are. We're going to tell you that as lawmakers. That's how you're going to carry out your psychiatric guidance for these individuals. Again, completely improper kind of a law. They shouldn't, it's not the place of the lawmaker to be prescribing how these types of patient to professional interactions should be occurring. So I think the temptation is there in a society that has lost many of its foundational insights when it comes to respect for the moral law and the natural law. We've moved away from so many of them. We have a culture that widely supports and promotes the direct taking of life through abortion. We're moving towards seeing it in not only physician-assisted suicide, but euthanasia, and in other ways, some concerns around organ procurement that are occurring. So as the society veers in that direction, then the lawmakers become more and more tempted to try to impose their vision of, that's morally, has a moral deficit really at the core of it onto the rest of society.
Yeah, so you had mentioned this tendencies of some states to start banning any conversations in counseling other than affirming the gender dysphoria that a minor comes to them. As of today, we just actually had oral arguments in Charles v. Salazar of the date recording, so it's worth giving that one a shout out. Where Colorado and a number of other states have actually banned any conversations other than affirming, a gender identity that is inconsistent with a minor's sex, and it's just so wild to see lawmakers, like you said, coming in and prescribing what they see fit to be the necessary medical practices.
Yes, yes, I agree. I think here we have to make sure to kind of restrain what the lawmakers can do. And I think, again, good lawyers, good faithful lawyers, lawyers of conviction here is what we need. And there are some outcomes that I'm convinced in a society are only going to be able to be achieved through legal pressure. And in looking at the whole gender dysphoria situation, there was a lot of damage that has been done to young people who were sort of put on the conveyor belt and received all kinds of treatments, but they weren't treatments, they were really acts of mutilation. And now we have some of these young people, hitting their 20s and saying, wait a minute, what just happened to me? And lawsuits, which are, in fact, having quite an impact. And I'm grateful to see that. There was the Tavistock Clinic in London that was shut down by a major lawsuit there. And I thought, It's a shame it required it to go all the way through the courts in London. But if that's what it takes for us to sort of recover and start assuring respect for human dignity, especially of vulnerable young people, well, then we just need to make sure that we have, some good, convicted, and strong lawyers who will do that challenging task.
That's a very astute insight. I've thought that for several years now, that it would be probably not legislation, but a few well-placed 9 and 10-figure settlements against hospital networks for doing these procedures that would probably end the reign of these surgical and medical procedures, especially for minors. Um, yeah, I have a couple of follow-ups. You said a lot that I would love to cover. I know we have limited time now, but one I think that is it's hard to navigate because, as you said, our legislature, our political process, just our general culture has moved in a lot of areas quite far from the natural moral law, and to the point where um, it makes one wonder how much we can do with the law. Because, as you said, we certainly shouldn't have legislatures stepping in and mandating that, the morning after pill, for example, be given to women. But I think we should have certain legal strictures, for example, saying that doctors cannot kill children in the womb or cannot end innocent life. But it's hard because we live in such a relativistic culture where we just get accused of, applying our religious principles through the law. And so it's kind of a hard balance of where can we actually legislate for the common good and where are we kind of forced to play defense at this point. I don't know if you
Yeah,
have any comment on that.
yeah, no, I agree. I mean, there's a strong sense of moral relativism that's out there. And I think it's such an incoherent position. Most people haven't really been pushed to reflect on moral relativism too much. They're just like, well, you can have your moral view and I can have mine. Whatever you think goes is okay, and whatever I think goes is okay. But I say, look, if that were the case, if that doesn't apply to anything else in the rest of reality, if we're both driving towards an intersection from different angles, and you just want to decide that the light is red, and I want to decide that it's green, and we're going to have some awful accidents at our intersections if we just make it up as we go along. And that's the kind of prescription that people have been told they can follow, and it makes no sense at all. The other thing is that part of the way you sort of disarm your opponents on this is to say something like, well, you shouldn't be imposing your natural law view of the universe onto the rest of us. You shouldn't be imposing it. But you know what? The reality here is that there is always going to be some kind of imposing that's going to happen. And it's only a question of, is it the right view of matters that will be imposed, or is it a flawed view? So it's super important that we as society have the kind of dialogue, discussion, and, strong view of what is right and what is wrong. We need to be able to say certain things as being definitive, like, look, it's always wrong to partake of human slavery. Can't we all agree on that? Let's start, with some foundational rights and wrongs. And pretty soon people are like, oh yeah, okay, there really is, there are some non-negotiables. It's not all right for me to have slaves and you not to, just because we have different opinions on the matter. We fought a terrible civil war over that. And all the rest of the moral areas that we're talking about in the medical arena, it applies there with the same rigor of logic. So I think the challenge here is to break people out of the illusion of relativism. It's a kind of soothing narrative that we say to ourselves to kind of get away with things. And of course, we as human beings, this is one of our flaws. We are so capable of self-deception, and all the time it's an invitation really to us from the Lord to return to the kind of beings that we truly are, aligned with the fullness of truth. And that indeed is what sets us free.
And well, there are a lot of ways I'd like to follow up there, but a quick anecdote that I think you'd appreciate, Father, because exactly on on your astute take on the limits, the quick limits of moral relativism, right? How fast that falls apart. I was talking to a friend who's actually a state legislator who's pro-life, but gets squeamish about imposing and we'll talk about like states' rights to do what they, individual states can do what they want on this issue. And I had just been reading the Lincoln Douglas debates, right, where it's a very apt analogy when they were fighting over slavery. And Stephen Douglas says, well, popular sovereignty. If the people of one state want slavery, let them have slavery. If the people of the other state don't, let that be a free state. And that's how we solve the issue. And Lincoln, I think, wins the debate with this one observation. He says, well, hold on, because we have a constitution that affords certain rights to life and liberty. And so the question is not about popular sovereignty. The question is the black man a man? Because if he is a man, then he has rights that popular sovereignty cannot override. And I was telling this to my friend, and I said, do you see how the exact same thing applies to the abortion issue? If you just replace black with unborn, you have a problem here. And he had nobody had ever had said this to him before. But
That's
I think
marvelous. Just marvelous example. Yeah. And I'll have to reread those debates. I'm glad you mentioned it because sometimes just, to be able to call up a reference like that and share it with people, light bulbs start going off over people's heads.
yeah. Well, Joseph, I want to turn it over to you. Do you have any lingering questions before we wrap up?
Yeah, no, thank you again for kind of this great walkthrough of medical conscience rights, some of their limitations and some of their actual implications. Before we wrap up, is there anything we haven't talked about that you feel is worth mentioning in this kind of realm?
Well, I think, I think I would say there is a certain timidity that I think a lot of medical professionals feel. And uh, I was, I don't know how long ago it was, a few weeks ago maybe, we celebrated in the church Cosmas and Damien. And these were two physicians early in the life of the church. And I was always impressed by them because they were known as physicians, they were respected greatly as physicians, but they had no hesitation to, at the end of the day, say, look, as healers, all of the gift of healing is something that comes from the Lord. And we just share the gifts that He brings to us. And I thought, that's what we need. We need to first have that sense, and then second, have the sense of conviction then that we can stand firm in the face of these cultural challenges because we know we're buttressed by the Lord, we're buttressed by this beautiful vision of the natural law. And anytime we stand by the courage of our convictions, I think there's a tendency to think, well, I'm just a little nobody and I don't really need to do, but God has given each of us a particular garden that we need to tend to. And if we tend to that garden well, even if it's not, affecting immediately all the rest of the world, it actually is. It actually extends far beyond the confines of that garden. So these conscience decisions of ours matter tremendously and do affect our brothers and sisters in ways that, we're only going to understand fully, I think, from the other side.
Yeah, I love how our conversation kind of revolved down to you don't think moral relativism necessarily is the first thing, and the problems with that sort of philosophy when you think medical conscience rights. But at the end of the day, it is really a discussion of are there things that are true that are morally prohibited, and that's a necessary kind of thing to conquer when you're getting into religious freedom at
Exactly.
large, particularly in medicine.
Yes, definitely.
All right. Well, I think that's a beautiful thought to wrap up on. So, Father Tad, thanks so much for joining us today. I know there's a lot to unpack on medical conscience rights, and we only really scratched the surface. But thank you so much for all the good work you're doing. You gave us a lot of great things to think about. Grateful for your time and your expertise and all that you're doing at the NCBC.
Well, thank you very much for having me on, and pleasure to, have the opportunity to chat about some of these vital issues. And yeah, God bless your work as well.
Well, we really appreciate you. And to our listeners, thank you for joining us as always for this episode of the Napa Legal Podcast. If you enjoy the content we're putting out, we always appreciate it. If you like, subscribe, donate, and continue to support the work that we are doing here. So we hope you'll join us next time as we continue to highlight and discuss some of the most important ongoing legal issues that affect religious liberty and especially the work of faith-based nonprofit organizations. We'll talk to you next week. Thank you.